Imagine a tiny rocky island in the middle of the Mediterranean. No forests, no rivers, no fertile fields, just stone, heat, and a handful of fortified towns clinging to the coast. Now, imagine that this barren speck of land stopped the greatest naval empire of the 16th century. Because this is the story of how the Knights of Malta, outnumbered, undersupplied, and almost forgotten by Europe, confronted the unstoppable Ottoman war machine at sea, and somehow won. For the Ottomans, the Mediterranean was supposed to be theirs. They had crushed empires, seized cities, controlled trade, and commanded fleets feared from Venice to North Africa. To them, Malta was just another obstacle, a small one, a temporary one, something to be swept aside with overwhelming force. But the Knights of Malta were not ordinary defenders. They were warrior monks, seasoned fighters forged through centuries of war with Islam. Men who had lost Rhodes, men who had vowed never to lose again. Their identity, their pride, their very existence depended on resisting the Ottomans at all costs. And it is here, between two powers on a collision course, that the stage was set for one of the most traumatic naval confrontations of the early modern world. A moment when ships creaked under the weight of cannons, when galleys sliced through open water, and when survival came down to grit, tactics, and the willingness to fight to the last breath. The battle between the Knights of Malta and the Ottoman Navy wasn't just a clash of ships. It was a confrontation shaped by revenge, honor, and the fate of the Mediterranean itself. In this journey, we'll explore how a small order of warrior monks prepared for an enemy that dwarfed them, how Ottoman admirals believed victory was guaranteed, how cunning strategy, brutal combat, and shocking twists turned Malta into a legend, and how the final clash changed the balance of power across Europe. But to understand how this unlikely victory happened, we must first step back to a moment when the Mediterranean trembled at the sight of the Crescent Fleet. And it all begins with a loss, one that the Knights refused to forgive. And to understand why Malta became the center of this explosive rivalry, we need to look at the trauma that shaped the Knights' determination. And that story begins decades earlier. Before Malta became their fortress, the Knights had already suffered a catastrophe so painful that it defined their entire identity. For more than 2 centuries, the Knights of the Order of St. John ruled Rhodes. It was their jewel, their pride, their stronghold against Islamic expansion. From Rhodes, they raided Ottoman ships, protected Christian pilgrims, and enforced their power across the sea. But in 1522, Suleiman the Magnificent launched a siege that broke them. Over 100,000 Ottoman troops were deployed against barely 7,000 knights and soldiers. For 6 brutal months, the island burned. Walls shattered. Streets turned to battlegrounds. Every day felt like the end. When the Knights finally surrendered, they lost more than a fortress. They lost their home, their purpose, their place in the world. Europe offered sympathy, but no real support. Many rulers feared the Ottomans. Others were too busy fighting each other. The Knights drifted for years, homeless and weakened, living on the hospitality of reluctant kings. But something else happened during those years of wandering. The Knights hardened. They trained. They rebuilt their order. They preserved their naval traditions. They swore an oath. The next Ottoman attack would not end in surrender. Finally, in 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V granted them Malta, a barren island with little comfort but enormous strategic value. Malta stood in the middle of the Mediterranean shipping routes. Whoever controlled it could disrupt trade between the Ottomans and North Africa, or between Europe and the East. The Knights accepted without hesitation. They began fortifying the island, expanding their fleet and raiding Ottoman shipping once again. In Ottoman eyes, this was an insult, a spark, a loose thread that needed to be cut before it unraveled their control of the sea. By the 1550s, tensions were boiling. The Ottomans dominated the Mediterranean. Their navy, under famed admirals like Barbarossa and Dragut, was unmatched. Their galleys could deploy thousands of skilled warriors. Their cannons were the best in the world. And yet, Malta kept getting in the way. Every raid, every captured Ottoman ship, and every rescued Christian slave reminded the Sultan that his domination was incomplete. And so, in Istanbul, Ottoman leaders began asking a dangerous question. How long would they tolerate the Knights' defiance? And what happened next turned that question into a decision, one that would unleash one of the deadliest naval operations of the century.
Jean Périsseau de Valette was no ordinary commander. At 70 years old, he had already survived 100 battles, spent years as a galley slave in Ottoman hands, and watched his brothers bleed on fields from Rhodes to the Aegean. His scars were his armor. His memories were his fuel. When he heard that the Ottoman Armada was preparing to sail, he didn't panic. He prepared. Valette understood one truth. Malta could not match the Ottomans, ship for ship or soldier for soldier. The Knights had only a handful of galleys and a modest fleet of support vessels. Their manpower was limited. Their walls were strong but not invincible. So Valette focused on something else, a strategy the Ottomans didn't expect. He ordered the fortifications strengthened, not just with stone, but with design. Every wall angled to deflect cannon fire, every bastion layered to create kill zones. Every street in the main cities prepared for bitter close combat. Valletta, the city that would one day bear his name, had not yet been built, but the fortresses of Senglia and Birgu stood ready. He stockpiled food, ammunition, and fresh water. He trained villagers to fight. He turned every able-bodied man into a defender. But Valette's most powerful weapon was morale. He told his men, there will be no retreat, no surrender. This will be a battle to the death. These words spread like wildfire. Malta's people understood that this wasn't just a siege, it was an existential fight. If they lost, the island would fall. Its population would be enslaved. The Knights would be wiped out completely. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Ottoman leaders dismissed Valette as an old relic clinging to a dead order. They believed the Knights would crumble under a single, decisive blow. But Valette had something the Ottomans didn't. He knew the terrain, the currents, the choke points, and the hidden coves of Malta like the back of his hand. And he knew exactly how to force the Ottoman navy into a deadly trap long before any siege began. But for Valette's plan to work, the Ottomans needed to arrive. And when they did, the sea itself trembled.
On May 1565, the Ottoman invasion fleet left Constantinople. It was a floating city of war. Estimates vary, but most agree. Over 180 ships, including elite galleys. Between 25,000 and 30,000 soldiers, janissaries, sipahes, artillery crews, and auxiliaries. Thousands of sailors and oarsmen. Enough ammunition to level a small kingdom. The Mediterranean wind carried them toward Malta with terrifying speed. As the fleet closed in, Maltese villagers fled into fortified cities. Bells rang, torches lit the walls. Watchtowers sent warnings across the island. Every knight rushed to his assigned post. Valette stood at the ramparts, silent, watching the Ottoman navy arrive. The sea bristled with movement. Galleys carved through the waves. War drums thundered across the water. The red and gold banners of the Sultan fluttered in the wind. To the knights, it looked like the entire Ottoman Empire had arrived at their doorstep. But not all Ottomans agreed on how to proceed. Two rival commanders led the invasion. Mustafa Pasha, a hardened general loyal to the Sultan. Piala Pasha, an admiral fixated on naval dominance. And lurking in the background was Dragut, the legendary corsair feared throughout Europe. These men had different visions for the battle, and their rivalry would shape everything. As the Ottomans landed, they immediately seized key beaches and inland routes. Artillery positions rose. Supply lines stretched from ship to shore. Camps appeared by the thousands. But Valette noticed something important. The Ottoman fleet did not strike Grand Harbor immediately. Instead, arguments raged among the Ottoman command about where to launch their attack. That hesitation was exactly what the knights needed. Valette ordered small galleys to strike from behind, harassing the Ottoman supply ships, not to destroy them, but to disrupt them, delay them, force them to divert resources. Every hour of confusion bought Malta precious time. But the Ottomans soon corrected their course, and their first target would shock the knights and force a high-stakes gamble. The knights knew the Ottomans would come by land, but the first real blood was spilled at sea. While the main Ottoman force debated strategy, Piale Pasha sent scouting squadrons to probe Maltese defenses. He wanted to test the knights' navy, gauge their readiness, and secure the waters around the island. But Valette refused to sit and wait. He ordered a small number of knights' galleys supported by local vessels to strike swiftly. Their mission: disrupt Ottoman reconnaissance, protect hidden supply routes, buy time for fortifications to strengthen. In the early morning light, the knights' galleys cut across the water. Their oars dipped silently. Their sails were lowered to reduce visibility. When they spotted the Ottoman scouts, they surged forward. The clash was sudden and brutal. Ramming horns cracked, ships splintered. Crossbow bolts rained onto decks, cannons roared at point-blank range. The Ottomans had numbers, but the knights had surprise. Maltese sailors hurled fire pots. Knights leapt onto Ottoman decks with swords drawn. The fighting was close, sweaty, desperate. In minutes, 3 Ottoman scout ships were destroyed. A 4th fled back toward the main fleet. It wasn't a decisive victory. It didn't stop the invasion, but it delivered something priceless: fear. The Ottomans realized the knights would not wait behind their walls. They were aggressive, unpredictable, and willing to strike first. This small victory also boosted Maltese morale. Villagers who had been terrified now saw hope. Defenders worked faster, knights trained harder. Even the wounded refused to rest. But the Ottomans quickly adapted, and when they returned to the sea, it would not be with scouts. It would be with overwhelming force. And this time, the Ottomans were not coming to test the knights, they were coming to crush them. Piale Pasha deployed dozens of galleys to blockade the island. Nothing would get in or out. He wanted to starve the knights, isolate them, and prepare for a coordinated land and sea assault. The blockade was suffocating. Ottoman ships patrolled every inlet. Supply boats trying to reach Malta were captured or sunk. Messages could barely escape. Malta was cut off from Europe, and the defenders knew it. But Valette refused to surrender control of the sea. He ordered daring night raids using small, fast boats. These were not built for battle. They were built for stealth. Under moonless skies, Maltese crews slipped between Ottoman patrols, striking isolated ships, burning supply barges, and freeing prisoners. These raids forced the Ottomans to stretch their blockade thinner and thinner. Still, the Ottomans had sheer numbers on their side. Soon, a massive naval engagement erupted off the coast when a group of knights attempted to escort a small relief convoy into the island. The Ottomans intercepted them, and the sea exploded into violence. Galleys rammed each other. Cannons thundered. The water churned with bodies and broken timbers. Maltese boats were torn apart, and only a few made it back to the fortress. But the sacrifice wasn't in vain. One small transport vessel slipped through the chaos and reached Malta's shore with gunpowder, food, and fresh fighters. It wasn't enough to win the war, but it was enough to survive another week. And in a siege, another week can mean everything. As bodies washed onto the beaches and smoke drifted across the water, both sides realized a brutal truth. The battle for the sea wouldn't be won with a single clash. It would be won through endurance, patience, and constant bloodshed. But the Ottomans were about to unleash a force neither the Knights nor Malta had ever faced. A commander whose name alone caused men to tremble. And when he arrived, the sea war would escalate into something far more deadly.
His shadow alone could change the tide of a battle. And when his ships appeared off Malta's coast, every knight felt the air grow colder. Dragut, or Turgot Rey, was not just an admiral, he was a legend. He had raided Italian coasts for decades. He had defeated Spanish fleets. He had outmaneuvered Venetian admirals, and he had humiliated the Knights of St. John many times. For the Ottomans, his arrival was a turning point. For the Knights, it was a nightmare. Dragut surveyed the Ottoman camp and immediately saw flaws. Mustafa Pasha's siege lines were too spread out. Bayale's blockade was strong but not airtight. And worst of all, the Ottomans had placed some artillery batteries incorrectly. He snapped orders the moment he stepped ashore. Everything changed. Dragut also knew the importance of sea power. He tightened the blockade, reorganized scouting missions, and planned coordinated attacks that would crush the Knights' remaining naval capabilities. His first move was swift and deadly. He sent a devastating raid against the Knights' smaller vessels. Ottoman galleys swept around the island, capturing coastal boats, burning fishing ships, and cutting off Malta's last sources of local food. The Knights responded with desperate bravery. A small squadron sailed out under cover of dawn to attack Ottoman artillery positions near the shore. They tried to bombard Dragut's batteries and weaken his foothold. It almost worked, but Dragut had anticipated the maneuver. He redirected his ships to intercept them and unleashed a deadly counterattack. Cannonballs smashed into Maltese hulls. Boarding parties overwhelmed outnumbered Knights. The sea turned red. The Knights were pushed back hard. Yet Dragut made one mistake, a single fatal miscalculation born of confidence. While personally inspecting artillery near St. Elmo, he stood too close to the front. A Knight's cannon, firing from the fort he was preparing to destroy, sent a shot that ricocheted off stone and struck him in the head. Dragut collapsed. The Ottomans rushed to him, but the wound was mortal. For 3 days he lingered in agony before dying. The greatest Ottoman admiral was gone. His death struck the invaders like a hammer blow. Morale wavered, orders slowed, coordination faltered, and without Dragut's fierce discipline, the Ottoman navy began making mistakes the Knights were ready to exploit.
With Dragut gone, the sea, once dominated by Ottoman galleys, suddenly looked vulnerable. Dragut's death created a vacuum in Ottoman naval command. For the first time, cracks appeared in their once flawless coordination. Bayale Pasha struggled to maintain order. Mustafa Pasha, furious over the setbacks on land, blamed the fleet for not choking Malta fast enough. Arguments broke out, orders clashed, resources were mismanaged, and Valette sensed opportunity. The Knights launched a series of daring naval raids designed to exploit Ottoman confusion. By night, small Maltese craft slipped out of Grand Harbour. They targeted isolated galleys, ammunition barges, and supply transports. These weren't battles, they were surgical strikes. The most dramatic occurred on a moonless night when a group of knights disguised their boats with dark cloth and approached the Ottoman anchorage silently. They hurled Greek fire onto several vessels, turning them into floating infernos. Ottoman sailors panicked, shouting as flames raced across the water. The knights retreated instantly, losing only one boat. But the message was clear. The Ottoman navy was no longer invincible. Still, the Ottomans remained dangerous. In response to the fire raid, Bayale ordered tighter patrols and increased defenses around the naval camps. He launched sweeping maneuvers to locate the knights' hidden routes. This exploded into a brutal clash days later. A small squadron of knight galleys escorting a shipment of gunpowder attempted to sneak into Malta. Ottoman scouts spotted them, and the chase began. The sea erupted. Masts snapped. Cannon blasts echoed across the bay. Boarding hooks scraped against armor as men clashed on blood-soaked decks. The knights fought like cornered wolves. They knew losing the gunpowder meant losing Malta itself. Against all odds, they broke through the blockade. 2 galleys sank, many knights died, but the gunpowder reached Malta. Inside the fortress, defenders cheered. One man whispered, "We live another day."
After being embarrassed by night raids, the Ottoman command agreed on a new priority: complete maritime strangulation. No more holes in the blockade. No more night raids. No more supply shipments slipping through. They would turn Malta into an island of starvation. Piali repositioned the fleet to form a wide encirclement, with overlapping zones of patrol. He distributed fast corsair vessels between the larger galleys, creating a layered defense. The sea became a cage. Any ship approaching Malta was hunted. Any boat leaving was destroyed. Even fishermen hiding in shallow coves were captured. The Knights' naval operations nearly stopped. Inside the city, bread shrank into crumbs. Water rationing began. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Wounded men begged for food that didn't exist. Valette understood the danger. If the Ottomans controlled the sea entirely, Malta would collapse, no matter how strong its walls were. So he turned to a desperate plan. Instead of challenging the Ottoman fleet directly, he sent out decoys, boats meant to lure Ottoman patrols into traps where knights on land could bombard them with hidden cannons. The ploy worked spectacularly one stormy night. 2 Ottoman patrol ships chased what they thought was a fleeing Maltese vessel. They sailed into a narrow inlet where knights had concealed artillery behind rocks. The moment the Ottomans entered the kill zone, the cannons fired. Splinters rained down. Oars snapped. The sea boiled with iron. Neither ship survived. This victory emboldened the defenders, but Pialin responded ruthlessly.
He began using chained slave rowers to push galleys even closer to the fortified walls, firing directly into Maltese harbors. He wanted to deny the knights even the possibility of sailing out. The cannon bombardments shook the island, smashing piers and sinking smaller boats. The knights' naval presence shrank to almost nothing. It seemed like the Ottoman plan was working, but the knights were not the only ones desperate. In Sicily, a relief force had finally begun to gather, and when rumors of this reached the Ottomans, panic forced them into a critical miscalculation. News of Dragoo's death and Malta's fierce resistance stirred new conversations. In Messina, a relief army finally began assembling. It wasn't ready, not by a long shot, but rumors spread faster than ships, and soon those rumors reached Ottoman ears. The rumors said, quote, "A massive Christian fleet is on its way. Tens of thousands of soldiers, dozens of warships." The rumor was exaggerated, wildly exaggerated, but the Ottomans didn't know that. Piale Pasha feared being trapped between Malta's fortresses and a Christian armada. Mustafa Pasha feared losing the Sultan's favor if the navy was destroyed. Their coordination cracked again. Piale insisted on pulling ships back toward open water. Mustafa demanded ships remain close to shore and continue bombardment. Arguments escalated into shouting matches in the Ottoman command tent. This confusion gave the knights fresh breathing room. Valette ordered his last few seaworthy galleys to push out and harass Ottoman positions repeatedly, forcing the enemy to stretch their naval lines thinner and distract them from land operations. The Ottomans grew increasingly paranoid. Scouting parties doubled, patrols extended farther out. Fuel and supplies ran dangerously low. And then came the moment that altered everything. One foggy dawn, Ottoman scouts spotted sails on the horizon, large ones. Piale panicked. He withdrew part of his fleet prematurely, leaving the siege lines exposed. Those sails? A handful of merchant ships blown off course. Nothing more. But the damage was done. The blockade loosened. Maltese boats slipped out. Information flowed in. Hope returned. Inside Malta, defenders felt the tension lift. Some cried. Others dropped to their knees and kissed the ground. The Ottomans scrambled to tighten the blockade again, but the psychological blow was irreversible. For the first time, the Ottomans considered the unthinkable. Quote, "What if we cannot win?" End quote. And that fear, the fear of being crushed by a Christian relief force, was about to trigger the most desperate naval decision of the entire siege. The Ottomans, anxious and overstretched, doubled down on aggression, but without coordination. Some galleys pressed too close to shore, exposing crews to cannon fire from hidden forts. Others drifted too far, leaving gaps in the blockade where Maltese vessels slipped through. Confusion became chaos. The fleet that had seemed invincible now resembled a storm-tossed flotilla with no clear direction, no unified command. Inside Malta, Valette watched carefully. Every misstep by the Ottomans was a lifeline. Every hesitation, every argument among enemy commanders was another day the island survived. But he also knew the cost. The island's people were exhausted. Food and water dwindled. Fear had taken root in homes, in kitchens, in hearts. Every day of survival demanded sacrifices beyond what most soldiers or civilians could imagine. And yet, the consequences of this siege stretched beyond Malta itself. News of the battle and the stalwart defense began reaching neighboring islands, Italian cities, and even the courts of Spain and France. Merchants recalculated trade routes, wary of Ottoman reprisals. Local rulers reconsidered alliances, now seeing the knights not just as a thorn, but as a symbol that resistance was possible. Fear had spread among Ottomans and Europeans alike, and in that fear, new opportunities were forming. The knights themselves understood that history would remember this moment not for victories or losses, but for endurance, courage, and ingenuity. Every small raid, every successful defense, every night of vigilance contributed to a legacy that would outlast the siege. Malta had survived, not because it was the largest fortress or the strongest navy, but because the knights adapted, exploited enemy weaknesses, and held the line when all odds seemed hopeless. And in this delicate balance of victory and survival, one truth became unavoidable. The siege had reshaped more than just the island. It had sent ripples across the Mediterranean. Every commander, sailor, and citizen felt the pressure of these consequences. The fear of misjudgment, the weight of decisions, the cost of mistakes. The siege was no longer just a battle for Malta. It had become a test of strategy, patience, and human endurance on a scale few could comprehend. Yet even as this long shadow stretched across the region, the final decisive confrontation, the one that would define Malta's fate forever, was still to come. And when it arrived, it would demand everything the knights had left to give. The stage was set. The Mediterranean waited, and the world was about to see how a small island and its determined defenders could turn fear into triumph and force the mighty Ottoman navy to reckon with the impossible.
As the final days of the siege unfolded, the Ottomans faced an unrelenting reality. Malta was not just resisting, they were surviving, adapting, and striking back in ways the empire had never anticipated. Commanders argued, soldiers tired, and the Grand Armada, once a symbol of unstoppable power, began to fracture under its own weight. Each failed assault, each costly naval engagement, each stubborn fort that refused to fall, chipped away at morale. Valette and the knights, exhausted but unbroken, exploited every weakness. Hidden gun emplacements shredded advancing troops, night raids destroyed supplies, strategic sallies from the fortresses forced the Ottomans to divert forces again and again. For every step forward the invaders took, the defenders had already prepared a counter, an obstacle, a trap, a reminder that Malta was alive and vigilant. Then came the final turning point. Misjudging the strength and resilience of the knights, the Ottoman commanders pushed forward with their largest assault yet. But by then, hunger, disease, and exhaustion had eroded their discipline. The knights' defenses, though battered, held firm. The cannons thundered, galleys collided, men fought until their arms ached and their lungs burned. And finally, as European relief forces began to appear on the horizon, even if only rumors at first, the Ottomans realized the impossible truth. Victory was slipping through their fingers. It was a moment of reckoning. An empire forced to retreat. An island that should have fallen, yet stood defiant. And in that defiance, a lesson emerged. Courage, strategy, and unyielding resolve can turn the tides against the most powerful adversaries. Malta had survived. The knights had endured. And what happened here would echo across centuries, teaching the world that even the smallest forces can reshape history. When we look back at the Siege of Malta, it's tempting to focus on numbers, ships, or cannon fire. But the real story lies in people. Ordinary men and women, hardened knights and terrified civilians, confronted an enemy that seemed unstoppable. They endured hunger, disease, and relentless assault. They fought not just for territory, but for survival, pride, and the legacy of their order. The Ottomans, despite their power, learned a crucial lesson. Domination requires more than size or firepower. It requires understanding, coordination, and respect for an enemy's determination. One misstep, one underestimation, and even the greatest navy can bleed, falter, and retreat. The siege also reshaped the Mediterranean.
Trade routes, political alliances, and military strategies all shifted in response to Malta's defiance. Europe watched, and the legend of the Knights grew, not because they had conquered empires, but because they had preserved themselves against impossible odds. Ultimately, the victory was more than military. It was symbolic. It showed that courage, ingenuity, and unity can create outcomes far beyond what seems possible. And it reminds us that history is made in moments when ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Malta's epic stand against the Ottoman Navy and want more cinematic storytelling about the battles, heroes, and secrets that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment which historical story you want us to uncover next. Your support brings history to life and ensures more incredible stories reach the people who love them.